Hello, welcome to the Time Expansion Project. I'm John K. Coyle, and as always, we'll explore the neuroscience and psychology of time perception, very prescriptively give you a recipe to slow, stop, and reverse the perceived acceleration of time most adults feel and experience the endless summers of youth again. In our last episode, we talked about the first law of time expansion, the law of contraction. This episode, we'll talk about the law of inversion, which is less intuitive and more important. This is the notion that the way we experience time in the now is actually often inversely proportional to how we remember it. So the way we experience time in the now is inversely proportional to how we remember it. So imagine if your job was to type a series of letters, numbers, and digits into a green screen of a computer in a little cubicle, and it was about 60, 70 characters long with symbols and everything. And if you got even one digit wrong, the screen flashed, disappeared because it had a check digit, and it started all over again. You had to do that for 10 hours a day. This was my job in college. I worked at Stanford's Green Library putting the new periodical codes into the green screen of the Green Library computer so it could spit out the Dewey Decimal cards and that the book could be, or the periodical could be filed correctly. I can tell you, I could sit in that cubicle and a half hour in, that clock would go tick, tick, and stop. Like time was eternal in that cube. It felt like forever. Every Saturday was agony sitting there in that cube. But here's where it gets interesting. Contrast that job with the first day of vacation. Let's assume that you're going out of town for a week. And so you head into the office on a Friday and you get there early, 7 o'clock, and you're working through your task lists and your emails, and you're just cranking away, and you're watching that clock spin on the wall because suddenly it's noon and you've got to escape. You got to take the Uber to the airport, you get on the plane, you get off the plane, you take another Uber to your resort, and then you get out and you have a walk on the beach, you see the sunset, you have a lovely dinner, you maybe go for a splash in the ocean, maybe pick up a book, and the whole day is over like that. But in memory, these invert. This is where it gets interesting. So the days of typing boring numbers and digits into the computer, as long as it felt in the present, in memory it disappears to nothing. In fact, there's nothing to remember there. Everything you know about my job at Stanford's Green Library, it's all I know as well. We know the same amount of information. That's all there is to know. But the first day of vacation is sort of like a completely different experience as time is expansive. And so the metaphor here is of two types of cameras. A surveillance camera for the long, boring, tedious days. That's a slow frame rate. It's black and white, it's grainy, doesn't really carry sound or other things. And so a surveillance camera can store an entire week in 1 gigabyte. But the first day of vacation, that's like an 8K camera, right? It's running at a gigabyte a second. It's storing so much information in the present that it feels like you're chasing the present, like you're behind. That's why it feels fast in the present. But in memory, it's like your hard drive is chugging to store all this stuff. But in memory, it's lights, colors, action, sound. You can zoom in, zoom out, rewind. You have so much information. The first day of vacation is always so expansive because you're having so many unique new experiences. And so how do you put this law into your favor? Well, you have to design the kinds of experiences that put you in the state of flow and are based in stories. So the key attributes here are memories and meaning, not repetition and routine. Memories and meaning, not repetition and routine. In fact, routine is the death of time. If you've ever found yourself in the parking garage and you don't know how you got there, that's because the brain didn't write it down. I would argue you're dead when that happens. And so get rid of as many routines as you can. The other thing you could do is ritualize the ones you must keep. If you have children, I would argue, if I was to ask the audience, if there was one, to raise your hands, most people would say they have a ritual, not a routine for putting their children to bed. So what is a ritual? Well, it's something that adds value to the process. Is it singing? Is it reading them a book? How do you add value to that process? You might not remember the individual memories of that ritual, but they add value over time. I have a good friend that shaving is a routine for men. It adds essentially no value other than being able to go to work. But for my friend, he switched to the straight razor, uses the brush and the straight razor, and for him it's 3-4 minutes of mindfulness every morning. So that's a ritual. So what can you ritualize and get rid of routines? And then it's a whole nother lecture, we'll get into it, but if you're not familiar with the flow state is the peak performance zone or your optimal self, and this is where your peak performance comes out. And there's a strange thing that happens, which is time disappears or speeds up or both. So you say, where did the time go? Or time went so fast, or time stopped. All of your internal clocks stop measuring time. And so that's why you have difficulty describing it. But this is when you're like, oh my God, where did those 3 hours go? And, the great example here of flow state, which we all get into, and the inverse, which is the tedious times, is, you're in a boring business meeting with some, person you barely know sitting next to you, and you're trying to remember if they have kids and what you talked about last time, and you're agonizing, you look at your watch at what seems like 3 hours and 20 minutes has gone by. But then your best friend flies in from out of town. You haven't seen him or her for 5 years, and it doesn't matter because you pick up right where you left off, and the conversation starts flowing, and you're having a coffee or a cocktail, and what seems like 20 minutes later and 3 hours have gone by. That's the nature of flow. Whenever you're in a situation where time is seeming to speed up, but you're in a place where you're not measuring it, that's the flow state. That's your area of strengths. That's your area of talents. That's what you want to do more of. And finally, we want to create stories, right? One of the main principles of this whole series of talks is that when life gives you choices, choose the one that makes the best story. Now, why is that? Well, because humans are wired for stories, number one, through long history, 50,000 years plus of oral tradition. But here's the thing, how do we put this law in our favor? And I have some advice for you you're not going to like, which is to design fear and suffering into your vacations. Okay, why would you do that? Because, as we know, humans are wired to remember stories. And stories have a very specific outline that they always follow. In order to have a story, you must have a plot. In order to have a plot, you must have a crisis. If you don't have a crisis, you don't have a plot. If you don't have a plot, you don't have a story. If you don't have a story, you're not going to remember it. Therefore, you must design fear and suffering into your vacations. It's just logic. A few years ago, 8 years ago, February, I was invited to do a keynote speech down in Playa del Carmen, Mexico. It was a fancy affair. They flew me and my daughter, 13 years old at the time, first class, down to Cancun, and then we took the Escalade to outside of Playa del Carmen. We stayed at this amazing resort where we had our own pool on our balcony. It was expansive and beautiful, and we could have sat by the pool and had cocktails and kiddie cocktails, but an hour after landing, I said to my daughter, hey, you want to walk to town along the beach? And she's kind of on to me, so she's like, how far is it? And I said, I think it's about a little over an hour. And she said, okay. And she was game, and so we walked down the beach and began walking, and the sun was starting to set. It was 4 p.m., and the water was vivid green blue, and we saw manta ray and starfish, and we walked through this estuary where there was all these Mexican families swimming and making tacos, and they offered us food, and we should have accepted them because we walked for an hour and then 2 hours, and then suddenly the sun does that thing it does in the tropics. It just disappeared into the ocean, and suddenly it's dark, and then the sand turned to coral, and we're stubbing our toes, climbing over coral, hoping we're almost there, and our feet are bleeding, and now we're both starving and hungry and hot, and there's a bunch of bonfires over there, and we don't want to go that way, and we don't want to go 2.5 hours back, and so we walk for another hour and a half, 4 hours. We're starving, hungry, tired, feet are bleeding, she's crying on and off, and then we see it, Fifth Avenue in Playa del Carmen. We smell it. All the wood and the meat roasting, and we walk down the avenue, down this cobblestone street, and we sit at this little Argentinian restaurant in these wooden chairs right in the corner, and then we ordered our appetizer, which was squid stuffed with goat cheese with a light white wine lemon butter sauce with a lid of parsley on top. This was 8 years ago. I can smell it and taste it now. When you create stories, you create memories, and they're so vivid that there's a before and after. Please comment and share. There's links above. There's also a link for the next episode coming soon.